The morning sun hadn't even reached its peak when the crowd began to gather outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists pressed against the iron gates, cameras ready, voices echoing off the ancient stone walls. Among them stood a woman in designer sunglasses and a white linen blazer. Her name was Margaret, though no one there knew it yet. She stood with her arms crossed, staring at the guard stationed by the palace entrance with an expression that could curdle milk. The guard was perfectly still. His red uniform was crisp, his bearskin hat towering above his head. His face showed no emotion, no acknowledgement of the hundreds of eyes on him. He was a statue carved from discipline and duty, but Margaret saw something else. She saw a target. "Look at this," she said loudly to no one in particular. Her voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. "They just stand there like props. It's ridiculous." A few tourists glanced her way, uncertain. Some smiled nervously. Others kept filming. But Margaret wasn't done. She stepped closer to the gate, tilting her head as if inspecting a piece of furniture. "I mean, really? What's the point? It's all for show. A waste of taxpayer money." The guard didn't move. Not a muscle. Not a blink. Margaret's voice grew sharper. "And don't even get me started on what this all represents. Colonialism, oppression, history drenched in blood." She waved her hand dismissively. "You're just a racist statue." The words hung in the air like smoke. The crowd went quiet. Phones turned toward her now, recording not the guard, but the woman who dared to say it. She seemed to feed off the attention, her chin lifting higher. Before we go on, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. You won't believe what happens next. Margaret took another step forward. "What, you can't even respond?" "Of course not. Because you're trained to be silent, obedient little props. That's all you are." Still the guard said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the distance, as if she didn't exist. But something was different now. The air felt heavier. The crowd sensed it too. They stopped talking. Stopped moving. Even the street noise seemed to fade. Margaret smirked. She thought she'd won. She turned to the crowd, ready to soak in their reactions, maybe even their approval. But when she looked back at the guard, something had changed. His jaw was set just a fraction tighter. His shoulders, though still perfectly square, seemed to hold a coiled tension. And then, without warning, he moved. Not much. Just his eyes. They shifted slowly, deliberately, until they locked directly onto hers. Margaret froze. The smirk melted from her face. For the first time that morning, she felt something she hadn't expected. Fear. Not the kind that makes you scream. The quiet kind. The kind that creeps into your chest and tightens around your lungs. The guard's gaze was steady, unblinking. It wasn't angry. It wasn't hateful. It was something far more unsettling. It was knowing, and then in a voice so calm it could have been discussing the weather. "He spoke, madam," he said, his tone precise and measured. "You have approximately 10 seconds to step back behind the line before I am authorized to treat you as a security threat." The crowd gasped. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her confidence crumbled like paper in the rain. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet, her face flushing red. But the guard wasn't finished. And what he said next would change everything. Margaret's heel caught on the pavement as she backed away, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The guard's eyes remained on her, unwavering, as if he could see straight through her expensive clothes and into the hollow space where her courage used to be. 9, he said quietly. She held up her hands, palms out, trying to laugh it off. I was just making a point. Freedom of speech, right? I wasn't doing anything wrong. 8. The crowd had formed a perfect circle now, phones raised high, every lens pointed at the unfolding scene. No one spoke. No one moved. They were witnessing something rare, something real, a moment when words met consequences. Margaret glanced around, searching for support, for someone to back her up, to tell this guard he was overreacting. But the faces around her were stone. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked satisfied. A few even looked amused. "This is insane," she said, her voice cracking. You can't just threaten me for speaking my mind. The guard's expression didn't change. 7. Margaret's hands dropped to her sides. Her face was no longer just flushed. It was pale beneath the red, a sickly combination of shame and panic. She took another step back, but her legs felt weak, unsteady. She looked at the guard again, desperate now, hoping he would stop, hoping this was just some kind of scare tactic. 6. Gotta. Okay. Okay. She shouted, throwing her hands up. I'm moving. I'm going. But the guard wasn't counting down to make her move. He was counting down to something else. And somehow, on some instinctive level, Margaret knew it. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to tighten around her, in the way the crowd held its collective breath. 5. A man in a dark suit appeared from the side of the gate. Then another. They moved with the kind of smooth, purposeful stride that suggested they'd done this before. Security. Royal security. Their eyes scanned Margaret, the crowd, the area, assessing everything in seconds. Margaret's stomach dropped. Wait, this is ridiculous. I didn't do anything. I didn't touch anything. I just said some words. The guard's voice cut through her rambling like a blade. 4. One of the security officers stepped forward. Ma'am, you need to come with us. No, Margaret said, shaking her head. No, I'm a tourist. I have rights. You can't just 3. The second officer moved closer, positioning himself on her other side. Not touching her. Not yet. But close enough that she could feel the weight of their presence, the unspoken promise that if she didn't comply, they would make her. Margaret's eyes darted between them, then back to the guard. He was still staring at her. Still counting, still utterly calm. It was that calmness that terrified her most. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He was simply doing his job. And his job, she was beginning to realize, involved far more than standing still and looking impressive. 2. All right. She screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. All right, I'll go. Just stop counting. The guard paused. His eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment Margaret thought she saw something flicker there. Not sympathy, not pity. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who had seen this exact scene play out a dozen times before. Entitled tourist who thought the rules didn't apply to them. Who thought the guards were props, decorations, performers in a theme park? 1, he said softly. Margaret turned and walked quickly toward the officers, her head down, her shoulders hunched. The crowd parted for her like water, silent and watching. A few people whispered. A few filmed. But most just stared, absorbing the lesson she'd just been taught. The officers escorted her away from the gate, toward a side building where tourists weren't allowed. Her protests grew quieter as they disappeared from view. Swallowed by the palace grounds and the machinery of royal protocol, the guard turned his gaze back to the horizon, his face reset to its original stillness. The incident, as far as he was concerned, was over. But for the crowd, it was just beginning. Phones buzzed with messages. Videos uploaded in real time. Within minutes, the clip of Margaret being escorted away would be spreading across the internet like wildfire. But there was more to this story. Much more. Because while Margaret was being questioned in a small, sterile room inside the palace, the guard's commanding officer was watching the whole thing unfold on a monitor. And he was smiling, not because he enjoyed seeing someone humiliated, but because he knew something the crowd didn't, something even Margaret didn't know. The guard she'd insulted wasn't just any guard. Margaret sat in the small room with her arms wrapped around herself, her designer sunglasses still perched on top of her head. The officers had left her alone after taking her identification and asking a series of clipped questions. She'd answered them with increasing irritation, insisting she'd done nothing wrong, that she was the victim here, that this was all a massive overreaction. But they hadn't argued. They'd simply written things down and left. Now she sat in silence, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Her phone had been taken temporarily. Her confidence had been taken permanently. All she could do was wait. Outside, the crowd had slowly dispersed, though not without a final spectacle. The guard had been relieved by another, a formal changing that tourists always love to watch. But the whispers continued. People talked about what they'd seen, about the woman who'd pushed too far, about the guard who'd responded with icy precision. What they didn't talk about, because they didn't know, was who that guard was. His name was James Hartley. He was 28 years old. He'd served in the Royal Army for 6 years before being selected for the Ceremonial Guard unit. But his service hadn't been ceremonial. Not in the beginning. James had done 2 tours in hostile territories. He'd seen combat. He'd lost friends. He'd carried men out of burning vehicles and held their hands as medics worked to save them. He'd been trained not just to stand still, but to assess threats in fractions of a second, to make decisions under pressure, to stay calm when the world around him was falling apart. When he'd returned home, he'd been offered a position with the Ceremonial Guard. Some soldiers saw it as a step down. James saw it as an honor, a chance to serve his country in a different way, a chance to represent something bigger than himself. And when tourists mocked him, called him a prop, a statue, a symbol of oppression, he didn't take it personally. He understood that they didn't know. They couldn't know. They saw the uniform, the tradition, the spectacle. They didn't see the hours of training, the physical endurance, the mental discipline, the pride. But every so often, someone crossed a line. And when they did, James was authorized to respond. Margaret didn't know any of this. She didn't know that the man she'd insulted had saved lives, that he'd put his body between danger and innocence more times than she could count, that his stillness wasn't weakness. It was strength in its purest form. The door to the room opened. Margaret looked up sharply, expecting the officers to return. Instead, a man in a different uniform stepped inside. Older, silver hair cropped short. A row of medals on his chest. His eyes were sharp and assessing, the kind of eyes that missed nothing. "Ms. Margaret Thompson," he said, glancing at a file in his hand. American citizen. Visiting London for a week. Staying at the Langham Hotel. Margaret straightened. "Yes, and I'd like to know why I'm being held here like a criminal." The man closed the door behind him and sat down across from her. He set the file on the table between them and folded his hands. "You're not being held. You're being questioned. There's a difference. I didn't do anything illegal." "No," he agreed. "You didn't? But you did violate palace protocols. You approached the security line after being given a verbal warning. You refused to comply with an order from a member of the Ceremonial Guard. And you did so in a manner that created a public disturbance." Margaret crossed her arms. "I was exercising my right to free speech." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't the United States, Miss Thompson. And even if it were, free speech has limits. You're free to say what you like, but you're not free from the consequences." "So what? You're going to arrest me?" "No," he said simply. "We're going to educate you." Margaret blinked. "Excuse me?" The man leaned back in his chair. "The guard you insulted this morning. His name is Corporal James Hartley. He's a decorated veteran. He's served in some of the most dangerous regions on Earth. He's been shot at. He's saved lives. He's earned every piece of that uniform." Margaret's face flickered with something. Doubt, maybe. Or the first hint of regret. "When you called him a racist statue," the man continued, his voice calm but firm, "you weren't just insulting him. You were insulting every man and woman who's served. Every person who's put on a uniform and stood between their country and chaos. You reduced their sacrifice to a political slogan." Margaret started, then stopped. For the first time since she'd arrived, she had no words. The man said, standing up, "You're free to go. Your phone will be returned to you at the front desk. But before you leave, I want you to think about something. That guard you mocked, he could have had you detained. He could have made this much worse for you. But he didn't. He gave you a chance to walk away. And when you didn't take it, he did his job. Nothing more. Nothing less." He walked to the door, then paused. "One more thing. The video of your encounter has already been viewed over 1 million times online. I imagine by tonight, it'll be much higher. So whatever point you were trying to make, the world heard it, and they've made their judgment. He left. The door clicked shut, and Margaret sat alone, staring at the empty chair across from her, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest like a stone. Margaret walked out of the palace grounds 20 minutes later. Her phone was in her hand, buzzing relentlessly. Notifications, messages, tags, her social media accounts were exploding. She'd been tagged in dozens of videos, all showing the same scene from different angles. Her face, her voice, her smirk dissolving into panic as the guard counted down. The comments were ruthless. Hey, stupid games. Win stupid prizes. She really thought she did something. That guard showed incredible restraint. I would have lost it. Imagine calling a decorated veteran a racist statue and thinking you're the hero. Margaret's hands trembled as she scrolled. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she'd been making a point, that people were twisting her words. But every time she tried to form a response, the commanding officer's words echoed in her mind. The world heard it, and they've made their judgment.
Oh.
She shoved her phone into her purse and started walking, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Tourists passed her, some glancing twice, recognition flickering in their eyes. She pulled her sunglasses down over her face and walked faster. Back at her hotel, she locked herself in her room. The walls felt too close. The air felt too thin. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her reflection in the mirror across from her. The confident woman who'd stood outside Buckingham Palace that morning was gone. In her place was someone smaller. Someone unsure. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from her sister back in California. Margaret let it ring. Then ring again. On the third attempt, she answered. Maggie, what the hell? Her sister's voice came through sharp and disbelieving. You're all over Twitter? People are sending me links. What were you thinking? Margaret closed her eyes. I was trying to make a statement. About the monarchy, about colonialism. You know how I feel about these things. Yeah, I know how you feel, her sister said. But there's a difference between having an opinion and screaming it at someone who's just doing their job. That guard didn't colonize anything. He's just standing there. Represents it, though. The whole institution stop, her sister interrupted. Just stop. You embarrassed yourself. And honestly, you embarrassed me too. Mom's already called me 3 times. She's mortified. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. I didn't mean for it to go like this then. What did you mean? She didn't have an answer. The truth was, she hadn't thought it through. She'd seen an opportunity to say something bold, something that would get attention, and she'd taken it. She hadn't considered the guard's feelings, hadn't considered his story, hadn't considered anything beyond her own need to be heard. I have to go, her sister said after a long silence. Just think before you speak next time, please. The line went dead. Margaret set the phone down and stood up. She walked to the window and looked out over London. The city stretched before her, ancient and modern, all at once. Somewhere out there, James Hartley was probably finishing his shift, going home, living a life that had nothing to do with her, and yet she'd tried to reduce him to a symbol, a prop, a target for her frustration with systems and histories she didn't fully understand. She thought about what the commanding officer had said, about James's service, about the lives he'd saved, about the uniform he'd earned. For the first time, she felt something she hadn't expected. Guilt. Real, heavy guilt. The next morning, Margaret woke early. She hadn't slept well. The guilt had followed her into her dreams, twisting them into strange, uncomfortable shapes. She got dressed slowly, deliberately, and left the hotel before the sun was fully up. She took the tube to the palace. The streets were quieter now, just a few early joggers and vendors setting up their carts. She stood outside the gates, watching as a new guard took his position. Not James. Someone else. But it didn't matter. She stood there for a long time, just watching, thinking, trying to understand what she'd failed to see before. A young boy approached the gate with his father, eyes wide with wonder. "Dad, why do they stand so still?" he asked. His father smiled. "Because they're protecting something important. And sometimes the best way to protect something is to stay strong. To stay focused, even when people don't understand." The boy nodded, satisfied, and they moved on. Margaret stayed. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of tradition and duty, she finally understood what she'd done. Not just the insult, not just the scene, but the casual cruelty of dismissing someone's service, someone's sacrifice, because it didn't fit neatly into her worldview. She didn't know if she could fix it, didn't know if she should even try. But she knew one thing: she owed James Hartley an apology. And whether he ever heard it or not, she needed to say it. Margaret spent the next 2 days trying to figure out how to reach James. She couldn't just walk up to the palace and ask for him. That wasn't how things worked. She tried calling the palace's public information line, but they politely told her they couldn't forward personal messages to staff members. She considered writing a letter, but that felt too distant, too easy, too much like avoiding real accountability. Finally, she found a veterans support group online that worked with former and current members of the ceremonial guard. She sent them a message explaining who she was and what had happened. She didn't make excuses, didn't try to spin it. She just told the truth. "I insulted someone who didn't deserve it. I want to apologize. If there's any way to reach him, I'd be grateful." She hit send and waited. 2 days later, she got a response. It wasn't from James. It was from the organization's director, a woman named Helen who'd served in the military herself. "We've passed your message along," Helen wrote. "Whether he chooses to respond is up to him. But I'll say this. Most people don't bother to apologize. The fact that you're trying means something." Margaret read the message 3 times. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. On her last day in London, Margaret went back to the palace one more time. It was late afternoon, the golden light casting long shadows across the courtyard. Tourists were gathered for the changing of the guard, cameras ready, excited chatter filling the air. She stood at the back of the crowd watching, and then she saw him, James Hartley. Same red uniform, same bearskin hat, same perfect stillness. Her heart pounded. She wanted to call out to him, to wave, to somehow get his attention. But she knew better. He was on duty. He was doing his job. The last thing he needed was another distraction from her, so she just watched. And as she did, something strange happened. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, broke away from her mother and ran toward the gate. She was holding a small bouquet of flowers, the kind sold by vendors on the street. Her mother called after her, panicked. But the girl was fast. She stopped just short of the security line and held the flowers up toward James. "For you," she said in a small, clear voice, "because you're brave." The crowd fell silent. Everyone watched. James didn't move at first. He couldn't. Protocol dictated that he remain still, focused, professional. But then slowly he shifted his gaze downward. Just for a moment, just long enough to see the girl's face, her hopeful eyes, the flowers clutched in her small hands, and then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Just a flicker, a tiny crack in the perfect facade, and he gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. The girl beamed. She set the flowers down carefully at the base of the gate and ran back to her mother, scooped her up with a mixture of relief and pride. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras clicked. People cheered. It was a moment of pure, unscripted humanity. A reminder that beneath the uniform, beneath the discipline, there was a person. A person who appreciated kindness, even in the smallest forms. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't try to stop them. She just stood there watching, letting the moment wash over her. When the ceremony ended and the guards rotated out, Margaret stayed. She didn't know if James would see her, didn't know if he'd care, but she had to try. She approached one of the palace staff members near the gate. A young man in a crisp suit with a radio clipped to his belt. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quieter than it had been days ago. "I know this is unusual, but Is there any way I could speak to Corporal Hartley? Just for a moment. The man looked at her carefully. She could see the recognition in his eyes. He knew who she was. He'd probably seen the video. Wait here, he said finally. He disappeared through a side door. Margaret waited, her heart hammering. 5 minutes passed, then 10. She was about to give up when the door opened again. James Hartley stepped out. He was out of uniform now, wearing jeans and a simple jacket. He looked different, younger, more approachable. But his eyes still carried that same steady, assessing look. He walked toward her slowly, stopping a few feet away. You wanted to talk? Margaret nodded. Her mouth felt dry. All the words she'd rehearsed in her head suddenly seemed inadequate. I'm sorry, she said finally. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for how I treated you. You didn't deserve it. James studied her for a long moment. No, he said quietly. I didn't. She flinched, but she nodded. I know, and I can't take it back. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what you do. What you've done? I was wrong. Completely wrong. James was silent. Then he said, Do you know why I didn't respond when you first insulted me? Margaret shook her head. 'Cause I've been called worse. By people who actually wanted to hurt me. Your words? They were just noise. But when you refused to step back, when you ignored the rules, that became a problem. Not because you hurt my feelings, but because you disrespected the duty. I know, Margaret said softly, and I'm sorry. James nodded slowly. Apology accepted. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Thank you. He turned to leave, then paused. That little girl with the flowers? She reminded me why I do this. Not for people like you, but for people like her. People who still believe in something bigger than themselves. And with that, he walked away, disappearing back through the door, leaving Margaret standing alone in the fading light.